I have a question for the faithful community here on YouTube. This question applies to any and all of you who believe that a supreme being, which you refer to as God, is responsible for having created and designed life, the earth, or the very universe itself. So if you are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or whatever, I'd like to hear what your answers are to these questions that I have. First of all, before I ask, I'd like to bring up the observation that virtually every theist believes that God is responsible for having created life and the universe. This is evident by the pervasive use of the cosmological argument, which states that the chain of physical causation cannot regress indefinitely. It must end at an uncaused cause which is eternal and uncreated. But even while assuming that God exists, for the sake of argument, it still need not be the case that the uncaused cause was God. Let me explain. One of my favorite uploaders on YouTube, who goes by the name RobTheMonk8, made the point in a video about moral ontology that God's role as creator is completely divorced from his role as the moral lawgiver. In other words, a supremely evil, yet nevertheless omnipotent God could have just as easily created the universe as a perfectly just and omnibenevolent God could have. I would like to take this argument one step further. I want to point out that even while assuming the existence of a supernatural being who resides outside of time and space, it still need not be the case that such a being created space-time as well. The possibility that such a being as God exists is not logically dependent on that being having created the universe. Furthermore, we already know that this being called God is not the agent of all things that happen or come into existence. For instance, the standard theistic rebuttal to the problem of evil argument is that evil comes into being through the free will of mankind. God has given men free will, and man chooses evil. The rebuttal is the same for the problem of suffering. When we ask why babies die, or why animals suffer, why horrible diseases and parasites exist, certain types like Ray Comfort will come back with the explanation that we live in a fallen creation which happened when sin entered the world, and hence that pain and suffering exists is not the fault of God. I want to leave aside for now the problems that these rebuttals create. The point I'm trying to make here is that these arguments entail the concession that God is not the agent of all things that happen or come into being. Even as a believer of God, you must concede to this unless you are comfortable with the idea that God himself is the root cause of all evil and suffering. Of course, there are other more mundane examples of human agency, such as the technology that I'm using now, which was developed by human beings and enables us to communicate with each other in this fashion. Or any object that I can take and move about, such as this, is as much a product of my own agency as any act of evil that I might commit. With this in mind, I'd like to move on to asking my questions. As I mentioned before, virtually every believer of God believes that God created life and/or the universe. I'm reminded of Bill O'Reilly, the Fox News commentator, whose challenge to naturalistic theories of our origins is to ask, how did we get here? How did it all start? Etc. I'm going to assume, just within the context of this video, and for the sake of the argument, that God exists. So my first question to all theists out there is this: how did the Creator create? Mind you, I'm not interested in knowing that he created. I've already conceded on that point. I want to know how he did it. How did God create life? How did God create the universe? And if you want to say that God's voice created life or the universe, please explain how this works. Explain how matter is created from God's voice. If you can answer this question, please do so. Leave a comment below in the comments section or post a video response. If you cannot answer the question of how God created life or how God created the universe, then I have another question for you. Since you don't know how God created life and/or the universe, then on what basis can you make the claim that God was even involved in the creation process at all? I'll remind you that you cannot claim the fact that we exist as a basis for the claim that God created life and the universe, because unless you want to accept that God is the one and only agent of all things, and therefore that human beings have no free will, and that God himself is the source of all evil and suffering, you have already conceded that God is not the agent of all things that happen or come into existence. Thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to hearing your responses.